Here is the moment under oath that has everyone talking.
If there is any evidence that anyone affiliated with the Trump campaign communicated with the Russian government in the course of this campaign, what will you do?
Senator Franken, I'm not aware of any of those activities. I have been called a surrogate at a time or two in that campaign, and I did not have communications with the Russians, and I'm unable to comment on it.
And if that wasn't enough, then in a written request from Senator Pat Leahy, he was asked again, and he answered with a single question, Jeff Sessions, a single word. He said no to any contact. So, could he be in legal trouble? Is this lying under oath? Joining us now, White House ethics lawyer for President George W. Bush, Richard Painter. Counselor, good to have you. The simple question is what Jeff Sessions did with Al Franken lying or perjury?
Well, he didn't tell the truth. He needed to disclose the communications that he had with the Russians, if he indeed did have communications with the Russians. That was the clear point of the question, and that included any communications with the Russians during the course of the time that he was working for the Trump campaign. We know he had another job in the Senate and was, I believe, on the Senate Armed Services Committee. He says maybe that he made a phone call in that capacity. Now, senators on the Armed Services Committee, I hope, are not routinely calling the Russians. That's not what I expect the senators serving on that committee anyway. But the bottom line is that he did not answer Senator Franken's question truthfully. He needed to disclose any contacts he had with the Russians during that campaign.
All right, so one additional fact, Senator Claire McCaskill says she's been sitting on that committee for many years and has never had contact with a Russian ambassador during that time, just to your statement about what happens on that committee. But now the question remains the same. Legally, what gets him for perjury? Is failure to disclose enough? If you can't show that Jeff Sessions knew that these contacts were relevant to the response to that question and intentionally didn't offer them up, if you can't prove that, is it perjury?
Well, that's the question, and we need to know more facts. We had a similar situation, I don't think as serious, but 40 years ago or so with the Attorney General Richard Kleindienst, who testified at his confirmation hearing, and he was asked about whether he had ever discussed a certain case against the ITT with anyone in the White House, and he said no. And it turned out that he had discussed it. It was on tape with President Richard Nixon. Then the Attorney General Kleindienst made similar arguments. Oh, well, I thought you were talking about a different time period or something like that. And ended up settling that one out with the prosecutor for a lower charge, a lesser charge, which is failure to provide complete information to Congress. It's a misdemeanor, but it cost him his job as Attorney General, and actually he was reprimanded by Arizona
You think
State
that this
Bar.
could wind up in that category?
There are lesser charges.
Do you think that lesser charges could be realistic here?
That's in these types of situations. That is sometimes how the cases are resolved. We need to know a lot more about what happened. We don't know, for example, what was being discussed with the Russian ambassador. Once again, I don't understand why a member of the Senate Armed Services Committee is having unilateral discussions with the Russians. That's a big problem over there in the Senate Armed Services Committee if that kind of thing's going on. And at least you found one senator who's willing to say that she's not doing that. That's encouraging.
So you are saying at a minimum there is a legitimate basis for wanting to know more. The question is, how should that inquiry proceed? What's the proper way to do that?
Well, based on what I've heard thus far, I don't think he can continue as Attorney General. I don't think he was truthful with the Senate. He did not provide full and complete information in answer to the questions.
You think Sessions should resign?
Critically important. Based on what I'm hearing thus far, yes, maybe there are other facts out there, but I don't I don't understand why he did not disclose to that committee the conversations he had with the Russians. And this is not just any old question. This is about a country that has been conducting espionage activities against Americans throughout 2016, has been trying to destabilize our country since the 1920s when they were supporting the Communist Party. And this is serious stuff, what's going on with the Russians. We've already had one member of this administration have to resign for lying about contacts with the Russians. That's Michael Flynn, who lied to the vice president, very clearly lied to the vice president. And now we've got another one who seems to have trouble telling the truth about what he's saying to the Russians. And that's just not acceptable.
Richard Painter, thank you very much for making the case. Appreciate it. Allison?
All right, Chris, is the Trump administration moving towards giving authority to military commanders in the field to greenlight anti-terror raids without the president's approval? We're going to discuss how that would work next. Explain why that makes sense on any level. Thank you, Christine. So back to our top story. The Justice Department revealing that Attorney General Jeff Sessions met twice with a top Russian ambassador last year while he was an advisor for Donald Trump's campaign. However, Senator Sessions failed to disclose that in his confirmation process. Let's discuss this and more with CNN Pentagon correspondent Barbara Starr and CNN national security commentator and former chairman of the House Intel Committee, Mike Rogers. Hi.
Hello.
Mike.
Good morning.
If you were the chairman of a committee and during a confirmation process, a senator said something wrong and said he had no communications whatsoever with Russian officials, and then it turned out twice he did, how would you feel?
Well, it depends. You know, if he was answering the question thinking he was answering about did I meet with the Russian official in direct connection with the campaign, then I could see, but he should just clarify that. I think it's easily clarified if he does that.
Why didn't he clarify it?
I don't know, candidly. I've met with Russia. I was the chairman of the Intelligence Committee. I met with Russian officials, including the ambassador to Russia.
You met with this same ambassador to Russia, who U.S. intel officials believe is a top Russian spy. Why did you meet with him?
We were trying to, at the time, in Afghanistan, there was a drug problem in the north, and we believed that the Russians could be helpful in helping us stem the tide of drugs going back and forth. So you always try to find things to work on where you have mutual interest. So I met actually 2 times with the Russian ambassador as a course of my work on the Intelligence Committee. It's not unusual that you might have these meetings as a federal public official. And so I wouldn't run away from the fact that they had meetings at all.
That's the problem.
Yeah.
While that is a very interesting story and a little bit of insight into what you've done with your life, the question is, if you were asked about it in this context and you didn't answer the way you just did now, that raises the suspicion of why you hid the information that went to the direct answer to the question. Now, how do we find out more? Who will do this inquiry? Everybody's saying at a minimum we need to know more.
Sure.
Does Sessions have to hold a press conference and take questions? Should this be the House? Should it be the Senate? Should it be the FBI? How do you find out more?
It depends, but now the reason the Justice Department released information, my guess, is because those meetings were probably documented somewhere. You know, we're very interested in what the Russians are doing in the United States, clearly, and for good reason. They do a lot of bad things.
But that's a whole other story, right? This was from the DOJ, according to the Washington Post reporting. We don't know who there, but probably safe to say it didn't come from Sessions. He didn't direct this to be released, otherwise we would know that. So maybe somebody was worried about this, concerned about it, trying to cover themselves. Demands more.
Well, and again, I think this is an easy correction. If you listen to the context of the question, I believe, Mike Rogers believes he was talking about, did I have a meeting with the Russians in regards to the campaign, which in his mind, he did not. I think it's an easily answerable question by saying, I misspoke, let me clarify.
Does he need to recuse himself from investigations?
If there is an investigation, it is not a crime for a U.S. senator to meet with a foreign official.
No, she's saying
the bigger investigations, all
about the Russians.
Oh, about the Russians?
The Russian ties. I mean, he's the Attorney General.
I'm not sure he does. First of all, I'm not exactly clear that there's an investigation about meetings with the Russians, and I'm not clear what the crime would be necessarily. Now, it may have been a bad judgment thing for other officials to meet with them. I'm not sure if it gets to the point where it's very closely tied to people. If that, in fact, is happening, then he probably should recuse himself on those particular matters. But there's so many other things that the Attorney General needs to be doing today. He ought to be working and doing those pretty diligently.
And just so people remember the context here, because as you might imagine, this is getting spun 100 different ways.
Yeah.
Franken said, if there is any evidence that anyone affiliated with the Trump campaign communicated with the Russian government in the course of this campaign, not about the campaign, not about the election, that goes to what Leahy asked him. Leahy asked him if they were talking about the election. That's his answer, no. Here, it's just about timing. And Sessions goes on to say, well, I'm one of those people, and I don't know anything about it. That was the curiosity.
Yeah, the only defense there could be that he was talking about the fact that he meet with that Russian official on behalf of the campaign. He may have met with him on behalf of the United States Senate and his duties on armed services.
Yeah.
To me, that's a very different thing. He should come out and say, that's exactly why I had those meetings. Here's what we talked about. End of story. I would normally meet with the heads of state or their representatives frequently as a United States Senator or a U.S. Congressman.
Barbara, sorry to keep you on hold there, but we have you on for another top story today, and that is that there may be this shift in policy that commanders in the field, generals, will have more autonomy to act on raids more quickly rather than having to run it up the flagpole and get the president's approval. What do we know?
Well, maybe more autonomy. It's something that they've wanted. There was a big feeling in the Pentagon that the Obama White House were micromanagers. They wanted every detail on all kinds of missions before they would move and approve them. Commanders felt, some of them, they had a hand tied behind their back that they needed to move faster. The Trump White House at this point looks like it is willing to give them some of that flexibility. But there is a real bottom line here. It doesn't mean that the president is not the commander-in-chief and isn't responsible ultimately for every military operation to some extent out there. There is some risk involved in taking that step back. What our sources are telling us, President Trump will continue to be briefed on everything, but he is likely to give some more confidence, more authority to the defense secretary, to his top generals. When they say they want to do something, he's likely to approve it much more quickly. If some of these missions go wrong, if they turn tragic, it may be a risk for the president.
Right. Barbara Starr, thank you for that reporting. Mike Rogers, thank you as always.
Thanks, guys. Good to see you.
All right, we want to let you know that the man who questioned Senator Sessions, Senator Al Franken, is going to join us live in just a few minutes.